There is a tremendous tradition of activism in New York City, dating back to the 1600s when it was a colonial town, first owned by the Dutch and then by the English. There's hundreds of different kinds of things you can look at in New York City over the last several hundred years, but I would try to group them in two categories. One of them is activists who are pushing for an expansion of individual liberty, freedom folk. And on the other hand, people who are interested in promoting the public good, the civic weal, the commonwealth. These may look like they're on opposite ends of a spectrum, but in fact, I'll try to suggest that they actually work hand in hand. First, race and race relations. New York City in the beginning was a slave city. 25% of the population were African slaves. Some of the first activist protest movements were slave insurrections. After the end of slavery, there were the abolitionists in New York. This was a major headquarters with Boston pushing for abolition first in New York City and then in the South. After slavery was in fact over, this was the center place of the civil rights movement for black folks. In 1854, 100 years before Rosa Parks had her encounter with a bus, Elizabeth Jennings in New York City refused to get on a colored-only streetcar, took the case to court and won, an early triumph, and led to a variety of changes in civil rights legislation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the leading agency of black change, was in fact rooted here in New York, in Harlem, this enormous black conclave that emerges. And in fact, it continues on through the 50s and the 60s. We think about the civil rights movement being a Southern affair. It was, not to take away any credit from King, but there was an enormous support system that existed in New York City. Two, gender. The status quo for women in the colonial and early national period was profoundly dependent. Women had virtually no independent rights. The first feminist movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all that, is a New York City centered operation. It is also a center for sexual revolution. In the most modest sense, giving information about birth control, much less practicing it, was illegal under the Comstock laws. Margaret Sanger, his great opponent, in fact, was instrumental in sort of breaking through that kind of, those kind of constraints. And on to the contemporary feminist movement, which was in large measure in the 60s and 70s, again, centered in New York City. And the larger gender issue, New York, of course, since Stonewall at the very least, was the center of the great gay rights movement as well. Three, ethnicity as the organizing principle. First, remember, New York City is a port. It is the biggest port in the United States for a couple of hundred years. More than that, it is the point of entry for things coming from Europe and entering into the United States. The flow of capital, the flow of commodities, the flow of culture, the flow of ideas about proper ways of organizing society, and particularly of interest here, immigrants. It's not just that immigrants come and filter in individually. They come and they create massive enclaves. There's more Germans in New York, in Kleine Deutschland, than there is anywhere outside of Berlin, and the same thing with subsequent organizations. There's three things, I think, that are interesting about New York City activism and its relationship to ethnicity. One of them is that most of these groups are exiles and contain people who have got half their head on what's going on in New York, but half their head in the old country. So the Irish rebels, in fact, set up camp. Their international headquarters is in New York City. German socialists are here. Russian revolutionists are here. Leon Trotsky is living in the Bronx. Jose Marti runs the Cuban War against the Spanish Empire out of New York City. And on down to contemporary equivalents. There's a broader sense of activism that has to do with ethnicity, and it's made possible by these giant enclaves being big enough to sustain their own identity. And that is, in fact, the battle for multiculturalism, of diversity, of the legitimacy of toleration. Again, there's people on the other side of this. Most famously, say, in the early 1900s, there were the 100% Americans who insisted that hyphenated Americans were traitors. And this peaked around the time of the First World War. But there was a counter movement that was, in fact, inaugurated here in New York, which said this is an insane way of thinking. Multiculturalism, multinationalism is a positive good. It is what's the essence of New York City is, and we should, in fact, struggle to defend it. It was going to lose for a long time. In the 1920s, the immigration laws are passed that constrain the arrival of unwanted types that are, you know, sort of diminishing the ethnic stock, say the racists, basically. But it also becomes the headquarters of an anti-racist movement struggling to open the doors in reality. New York is the cultural and media capital of the United States from extremely early on, 1810s, 1820s, and the like. So out of this comes an effort to fight censorship, to fight controls on, in fact, what can be said. This is actually goes back to the colonial period when you've got John Peter Zenger and freedom of the press, on down through the American Civil Liberties Union, again, another sort of local enterprise. So the city is interested in cultural diversity as well as ethnic and demographic diversity. Two last items on liberties. One of them is political liberty, political freedom. You have to understand that from the colonial period on, the overwhelming bulk of the population simply could not vote. You had to be male, you had to be white, you had to have a lot of property. One by one, in a series of struggles to expand the franchise, to allow blacks to vote, to allow women finally to vote, getting down to the contemporary state of affairs, these movements, in fact, are spearheaded in New York City. And the last is religious toleration. We tend to forget that most religions were under the ban from the earliest days. In the colonial period, under the Dutch and under the English, if you were a Catholic priest and you were found in the city and you said Mass, you were subject to the death penalty. There were no Catholic churches in New York City until after the Revolution. And then it's a slow process, once again, of expansion. Anti-Semitism is rife in the late 19th, early 20th century. So there's a struggle, in fact, to expand religious rights and toleration as well. And New York becomes the center place of that operation. It culminates, in some sense, in the anti-fascist movement of the 1930s. All right, let me switch to the seeming opposite. Rather than expanding individual rights and liberties, expanding the provision of social goods. To some extent, this is really talking about capitalism and its discontents. The economic system was extremely powerful. Wall Street, of course, in New York was the center of capitalist development. And while it, in fact, was enormously productive and did all kinds of interesting things, it also generated fantastic levels of inequality. And the movement to contest the notion that citizens of New York were only entitled to what they could pay for was contested by the argument that citizens of New York were entitled to certain privileges like free education, like public health care, like constraints on the housing market and the rent control. It's as a counter-social ethic, and each of those areas is in fact marked by organizations, struggle, battles over those expansion of social entitlements. The culmination of this arguably is the New Deal. In which New York, which had tried out a variety of these things, including interventions in the labor market. So New York City is the center of the labor movement since the early days. Again, in the colonial period, they were the first unions. Unions were illegal. And there's a slow expansion through the 1830s, 60s, 90s of a movement that says it is legitimate for working people to organize in pushing their wages up, in shortening the length of the working day, in winning approval of requirements of safety and health in the workplace, most famously after the Triangle Fire of 1911 incinerated 146 girls who were trapped in a garment factory building. And the New Deal, in fact, picks up things that are tried in New York City. Again, fought for each one of these things. Social Security, for instance, public welfare and relief. These are programs which are worked out, applied in the streets of New York, and then taken by Franklin Roosevelt and the cohort of New Yorkers who come with him down to Washington, D.C. And at the end of this, what you're left with is a culture that is peculiar to New York. It's not unique. There are other cities in the US that have some of this. But when you look at this total of it, the battles over race, over gender, over sexuality, over ethnicity, over public space, over social entitlements, there's a reason that at the same time New York is understood to be the center of capital, the center of power, the center of the empire. It's also been the center of, yes, activist resistance to that status quo.